So guys, this is part 4 of our series on what we plan to do in 2025. If you haven't seen the first 3 parts, I'll pop them all over our faces. But we always get started with a trade. Scott, we have a 12-team Superflex PPR, 1.75 for the tight end start 10. Are you going BTJ or Jahmyr Gibbs and Courtland Sutton? Go ahead, man.
So the leverage is obviously on the Jahmyr Gibbs side, which is interesting because he probably was one of the more valuable assets this year. And going into the season value-wise, he hasn't gone anywhere but probably neutral, if not even up, given how few running backs there are that can vie for anything close to what he is. So I'm looking at this going, is it need-based? Is it resale value-based? I mean, Brian Thomas Jr. is probably the most likely candidate. If you said there was a receiver outside the top 5 that could be the wide receiver 1, like he's the answer.
Sure.
I'm just curious if the market would exist the same way it would have last year on a guy like BTJ, meaning like, do I really have to add to Jahmyr Gibbs to get Brian Thomas Jr. just because he is a young receiver? Like the only way for you winning this deal, if you get BTJ, is he just becomes a 20 point per game receiver, and that's it. If he's just what he was last year, give me Gibbs and Courtland Sutton because I can use him, and the market for Courtland Sutton or a similar type player, I think, is more ripe even in the offseason than it ever has been before. So I think I'll take Gibbs and Sutton, and that's going to be a theme of, do I want to tier off of an elite receiver like BTJ? Not necessarily, but I think this is a pretty elite return that I'm getting, and I'm giving myself some more flexibility. So I think I'll take the package here.
Shane, it's a 12-team Superflex PPR, 1.75 for the tight end start 10. Which side are you taking, man? BTJ or Gibbs and Sutton?
I don't know. I would probably stare at my phone for hours, if not days, maybe months, until the next season started. I think I want Brian Thomas Jr. I heard everything Scott said. Jahmyr Gibbs is probably as valuable, if not more valuable, especially from a production perspective, right? But a lot of his value, if not all of his value, is specifically tied to that production. So let's say, I don't know, he goes out and breaks a toe. Clearly not in the playoffs because he's done. See ya. But next year, if he breaks a toe, or if Brian Thomas Jr. were to break a toe, let's say they both break a toe on the same day, who's likely to get sold for less, or who's going to see a bigger value drop? I understand that there's new dynasty, that we don't care about future production. All we care about is right now, which is making running backs more coveted. So the Jahmyr Gibbs side, it is fair. I probably would ask for like an additional something with BTJ, even if it is a third, just to quench my thirst? No, quell my fears. I'll lean BTJ, but I completely understand taking the Jahmyr Gibbs side.
All right, so Scott, this is going to change. It's still early, but as of right now, how are you approaching the wide receiver position in 2025?
No, it's a loaded question because I think the first thing you have to really analyze is, what is the receiver market in your league? There's still a lot of players in your league that are playing with the old receiver market, where a receiver that's valuable, that's young, that should still be the king piece, other than elite players at other positions and draft picks. Like that's pretty much what you're trying to analyze with the market, meaning maybe not the elite receivers, so not the Malik Neighbors, the BTJs, the guys where everybody's like, oh, I'm building my team around those players. But the everybody else's, the guys that are still young, that have good value. You know, I'm thinking like the Rashee Rices, the Jordan Addisons, those types. They're automatically top 20 receivers, but what is their market? Can I still go to the market with Garrett Wilson and Drake London and get whatever I want to get? Last year, you could have had the wide receiver 12, and you probably could have gotten any running back in the league that you wanted with that package. Even if you had to add a second or something like that, you could have got anybody else pretty much at the other positions if you were willing to include that receiver in the deal. I don't think the receiver market exists like that anymore. Maybe BTJ, maybe Neighbors, Chase, Jefferson. Those are the names. Like, you're not going a tier down and going, I have JSN and I have Drake London. They're going to get me a deal that whatever I want because they're a receiver. So I think that's the first thing you have to really figure out. Is it a robust receiver market? If it is, I don't have a problem tiering off of a couple of those receivers for just the lowest common denominator of production. There's a lot of productive receivers that are no longer quote unquote valuable assets. And I think you can make those deals because people are still scared of somebody like Jerry Jeudy. Can even repeat what he did last year. But the reality is he's probably just as good as Xavier Worthy and Devontae Smith. Like he fits the same placeholder as those guys on your roster, but nobody wants to really feel like, oh, I'm down tiering to that unless they get a specific deal. So I think if you're willing to be the one that makes the deal, but you're not getting a first on top of Lad McConkey with Jerry Jeudy, you know what I mean? Like, you're probably not making that type of deal, but can you make a more creative deal where it's a leverage trade where you're still looking at your receiver core going into the year? And I feel better about this. Let's say I do have CeeDee Lamb. I have an anchor receiver, right? I have somebody I can go to pivot if I needed to. I'm not completely watering down my whole receiver core to where I'm like, yeah, my wide receiver 1 through 5 are all Courtland Sutton, Terry McLaurin
That's
types.
the worst.
So, but if you have 1, you don't need 4. You don't need this wide receiver core that you're like, oh my gosh, I have 5 of the top 15 in Dynasty, because most of those teams are not the teams that won last year. They're the teams that were built the complete opposite. So I think that's how I'm looking at this. Roster by roster, I want to give myself an out, maybe 2 with a receiver that I know if they get injured, I can still move them for something. But I don't need to have this obsession of I need to build, especially if my team is in the middle or I'm even rebooting a little bit, I don't need to go, well, I need every one of my core pieces to be wide receivers under the age of 25. We've seen that happen. Teams that are built that way, A, they end up being wrong on half those receivers. But B, that's not what's probably going to win, especially with more teams just focused on, I don't care about the future. I'm just going to go at whatever is scoring points this year. You got to have a higher standard to combat players like that just don't care as much about the future.
So part of how you got those running backs was because you had elite receivers that you could tier off of, that you could pivot off of. Like, you're not trading Courtland Sutton for Jahmyr Gibbs, just from a trade example I saw lately. You'd have to have someone like Brian Thomas Jr. You'd have to have someone like CeeDee Lamb. Now, what you do with them once you get them, if you know it's the Infinity Stones, you don't need all 5 to kill all the Avengers. But yeah, maybe you do hold on to 2 and then, or 1. And move off of those players to get other pieces on your roster. But I think, at least from a starting point, from a genesis, it's helpful to have those pieces, even if you don't necessarily plan on holding them until they're 30 years old. You know, I think a lot of times when we used to draft wide receivers, the thought was, well, they're 21, 22, and I can have them for 8 years. Now it's more like, all right, what can I do with them once they hit that level? What can I trade them for once they hit that level? How do I move a Justin Jefferson and turn it into a Brian Thomas Jr. and an elite running back? Is there a way to make that? Obviously, you can't do it now, but I'm saying beforehand, trading for BTJ before the season where it looks like, oh, I don't know if that's a great idea, Shane. You traded JJ for BTJ and Saquon. I don't know about that. But you know what I mean? Looking at it now, you'd be like, well, that's fine.
I think the one rebuttal to that is if you just look at how players are already looking at the landscape compared to last year, today, you have to be right on the receivers. Because a year ago, if you would have just had a young receiver and you were willing to cash in the Kyron Williams or the Chase Brown, somebody would have been obsessive about getting a receiver that was young for one of those guys. The reality is, if you're wrong on the receiver, guess what that receiver doesn't have? Lasting power. You know, a guy like Jaden Reed might not even be in the league in 3 years, let alone like a relevant scorer. Now, he's probably going to be on a roster, but I think we got to a point where we were just obsessed with any running back that especially had a better season than we expected, just will not be around in 3 years, right? Whereas I don't know if that's the truth. I mean, we would have put guys like Tony Pollard, DeAndre Swift in this group 2 or 3 years ago. And they're still better than half the receivers that were valued higher than them coming into last year. And if you told me who's going to outscore who next year between the likes of Michael Pittman or Tony Pollard, who's going to be better? You know what I mean? But a year ago, people would have wanted Michael Pittman because he's a young receiver that got a contract coming off 150 targets. How can he fail? He's safe. But then look what happens when he's not great and he's tied to a situation people don't like. No value, right? Like, nobody really even wants him. They'll take him, but he's not an asset where you go, well, Michael Pittman's wide receiver 40 in Dynasty. Let me go trade him for a running back that can give me 15 points a game. Nobody's doing that. Like, the only people doing that are the ones that are going, okay, I'm going to wait for this running back to get replaced, and then I'll do it. But that's where the market is flipped. It's not on the higher end receivers. It's not on guys that got even better from last year. You know, it's not on T. Higgins or Jordan Addison or Zay Flowers. Those guys are fine. It's the guys we would attach a ton of dynasty value to before the year, weren't great or weren't in situations that people like. And then the thought of trading like a starting running back, because that's all I'm getting is Michael Pittman. I don't want to do that. Give me the running back. Give me the 12 point per game running back that has some upside versus a receiver that's still on paper. Pittman's wide receiver 40, but is he actually an asset at all? Is he somebody that last year, people considered wide receiver 40 like a top 70 asset in the sport. This year, undesirable. If I have him, sure, I'll take him, but he's not worth anything. That's where the difference is. It's not the higher end guys. It's not the irrelevant guys. It's that middle group of receivers.
I kind of feel like everyone has valued wide receiver twos the same way that I feel like I have, where they're not that valuable. So like this doesn't feel like a sea change to me, but I think there's more people out there that thought that way than you think. I have no way to verify that other than the leagues we play in, right? Because a lot of the people we play with similar mindset. But I don't think that's a big sea change. Like you should have never been valuing a random wide receiver 2 as an elite asset over a running back, like I guess Kyren Williams, right? Like Michael Pittman versus Kyren Williams. Maybe that was a mistake, I think, of narrative. And like you said earlier about just assuming if a running back has a better season than we expected, that they're just going to fade away to dust. I guess maybe the rest of the market will come around to the fact that 1 year production might be more valuable than 3 years of mediocre production from Michael Pittman, just because he's a whipping boy at this point. So maybe it is worthwhile just trading that wide receiver for a running back. But I don't know that there's a significant difference between Michael Pittman and Tony Pollard. I feel like they're all in the same range. You just throw them in a bag, kick it around, and see what comes out. Like I don't feel like there's much difference between the two.
I think it's the parking value, though. A year ago, when it hits the offseason, nobody wants any of their value held in the Tony Pollards and DeAndre Swifts, right? Like, get rid of all those guys because there's no way they're even assets next year because they're running backs. I mean, I hate to call us out, Shane, but there's been 2 years of content before this where we would have told you sell any running back that's not elite right now. I don't even want them on my roster in the offseason. Right now, if you go try to sell, because on like Keep Trade Cut, Michael Pittman and DeAndre Swift, Michael Pittman's the better asset. Go try to make that trade, though. And last year it would have been, sure, I'll park my value at receiver. Now it's, I don't even want that receiver because he's not any good. That's, I think, the difference is people are more willing to go. And it's fascinating because we're coming into a strong running back class where there's actually more likelihood that these running backs do get impacted. But I just don't think there's the starvation for the wide receiver 40 through 80 like there was last year. Because a lot of people are like, solid. Like the masses have finally, not whether they're good or not. I agree with you. People have always realized the wide receiver 3 is probably an overrated asset. But I think now people just aren't as interested in those guys. Like if you don't have the chance to be a top 24 receiver, they have zero demand even in the offseason, which that is a change that I've noticed this year compared to years past.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's getting more name and age agnostic. Let's look at Terry McLaurin and Courtland Sutton, for example. Let's start with Terry. They're both attached to young quarterbacks on exciting offenses. Terry is historically seen as old, always produces, but just generally not desirable. What about him these days, though?
I guarantee you, come the offseason, it's going to be the same as it ever was, right? You're not going to pay a first for him, and you're probably most likely not going to be able to sell him for a first unless that first is 2027. I don't see a significant difference in how these players are going to be treated. Are you going out of your way to buy Terry McLaurin? Now, again, if you can get him for a second, sure, you're head over heels, right? You want a second and a third for him. Or, we were just talking about the whole Tony Pollard thing. So let's say someone comes to you and they're like, I'll give you Tony Pollard for Terry McLaurin. Is that good enough for you, Clay? Taking away your hometown bias?
Nope. Keeping Terry there.
And they feel like an even asset. Like even if you tear up at running back a little bit, I don't even know who you would consider above Tony Pollard that isn't, in the elite category, which is someone above that level. Just doesn't feel like Terry McLaurin type of wide receiver really sees a lot of change in their value, dynasty value. It feels like that steady heartbeat, whatever is good. What's it, 32 beats per minute? I have no idea. Whatever it is, it doesn't move. It's just a flat line, right? Not dead, but it just doesn't move. Like there's not a lot of wiggle there is how it feels for Terry McLaurin. Courtland Sutton, he's a little more valuable than he was last year because people like me said, well, he hasn't done anything in 7 years and he's probably not going to be anything. So he probably does have a little more value now. There's the Jaden Daniels effect, but there's also the effect that they're probably going to add to that offense, right? It's not likely that they continue to run out Amaziah Zacchaeus and Diami Brown and Noah, what's his face, and Ertz. Like there's a good chance, or at least a chance, that they're going to add something of more significance on that offensive side. So it might mitigate any good feelings the community feels about McLaurin. Plus, he is 30 years old. I don't think that agnosticism, I don't know if that's how you use that word, I don't think that truly extends to age right now. I still don't. maybe at running back, right? Because at running back, you're willing to live with the production for this year. But when you're buying a wide receiver, I still think in the back of people's minds is, what else can I do with this later when later comes? And there might not be a later for Terry McLaurin. I mean, he's not that old. I don't mean to be that pessimistic, but just, there's not a long later for him.
So, Scott, what are your thoughts on that? So, Jaden Daniels, Terry McLaurin, you've got Sutton and Bo Nix. Do you think that plays a part, the quarterback attached to the receiver? Does that kind of deflect the age stink?
It does, but I think that if you look at where McLaurin is, like, go to keep trade cut, it starts with DK Metcalf at wide receiver 26. Then you have McLaurin, DJ Moore, Ayuk, Jaden Reed, Keon Coleman, Jalen McMillan, Mike Evans, Jerry Jeudy, Tyreek Hill, Josh Downs, Ricky Pearsall, Khalil Shakir, Chris Godwin, Courtland Sutton. And then continues on, there's 15 more names. The only thing that separate those names is people's opinions on their situations and can they get production out of those players. Not a single name in there would I say people are knocking down your door to get. They may have their preference. They may say, yeah, you know what? I really still like Jaden Reed, or I still really like Jerry Jeudy, or whatever it might be. But that starts the range of just almost endless receivers where you have to find a reason to buy them, right? You have to find how their demand is in your league, because there's going to be somebody that goes, yeah, that's great. Terry's tied to Jaden Daniels, but he's also old. This is his best he'll ever play, and he is what he is, right? So the demand doesn't exist in a vacuum for any of these players because they all have warts. And I think that's where this receiver range feels the most exploitable, because just because it's keep trade cut wide receiver 27 doesn't mean your league will return any more for that player than they would Rashid Shaheed at wide receiver 49. You could argue him and McLaurin on your roster are the exact same thing. Why would I ever care which one I had unless I had a reason to go, I want Terry because I have Jaden Daniels, or I don't want Shaheed because I have Chris Olave on this same roster. Like, there's a totally different factor that would make you care. And I think that's where it makes it exploitable to go, how can I build? Because I need a couple of these players to compete. I need a couple players in here that give me my 13.5 points per game. You're going to need that to get by, especially in some of the deeper leagues we play in. But I'm not going to go at it and go, well, you know what? The one guy in this range that is just way better than everybody else is Keon Coleman, wide receiver 31, and I'm just going to move him up. Now, you could argue Keon Coleman is one of two receivers in this range that's under the age of 22. So there could be a reason where he moves up, even though he's probably at the bottom range of the ones I would consider are going to produce the most, right?
Right.
So they all have warts, but I think if you're looking at actually rounding out a receiver core, we all acknowledge none of these guys are league winners. None of these guys are going to probably jump into the top 10 or top 12. But we also do acknowledge that there's a lot of players in here that have something going for them, whether it's production, quarterback, youth, profile, something. But how do you want to play this? Can you really kind of determine what the market is for these guys and move in a range you feel comfortable? Maybe you don't want a ton of Darnell Mooney, but you still want 20% of Darnell Mooney next year. I bet you he's one you can get to 20% on, but can you use some of these receivers that are quote unquote more highly valued and get a little extra value on top so that you can use that value for the off season or use it in season? It's just, can you get those deals done? Because somebody may go, I have Darnell Mooney, you have Terry McLaurin. I'll give you a fourth on top of Mooney. And you're like, yeah, but one is really productive and one is Darnell Mooney. And you're like, yeah, but they're almost kind of the same thing. You know what I mean? Like, not last year, but going forward, they're not that different. And your league may not pay you for anything in this range. So I think that's the place I want to look for some value, because I think it's all the same.